Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the world. Welcome to the FIDIC webinar. My name is Dr. Nelson Ogunshaki, the CEO of FIDIC. I'm delighted, to invite all of you in joining us today, looking at combating corruption in the construction and engineering industry. This is a very, very important topic for our industry and actually for the world. And it's absolutely important that FIDIC, is hosting this particular, gathering. I'm delighted that we've got quite a lot of people around the world who are participating. I understand that we are close to 1,800 people registered. We are only hoping for about 50%. If we get more than that, we'll have challenges. Our capacity is about 1,000, but I would encourage you to stick with us. We have an exciting 1.5 hour session to discuss the subject about corruption, what the industry is doing, and how we're going to deal with the issue. Today, there's a lot of people who are joining us, but I'm delighted to just give you a heads up on where we are. I understand 1,800 people register, and in that list, you've got, Kenya being the biggest number, close to 550, followed by United States. There's a lot of people from different parts of the world who are participating. I'm really glad that you're able to join us today. Looking back from last year, we all know that COVID has impacted the world in a way that nobody, and I mean nobody, ever anticipated. And we're not out of it yet, but since the COVID hit us last year, quite a lot has been done. Over this short period, we hosted 18 webinars within 10 weeks, pretty intensive. We had over 15,000 people that registered, and within that, we have 9,000 people that attended from 150 countries around the world, close to 80 people that participated. We have 10,000 who's been following our YouTube since then to make sure at least what we did is still considered value. This year, our program is 3-in-1. We are taking what we do in FIDIC out through our committee, which is we're having a committee webinar. Today's program is about committee webinar, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We are looking at our new State of the World report. We published one already, and there's a couple of them coming up for the rest of the year. And we continue with the FIDIC webinar, on COVID series. And you can see the date of when the activities continue to come up with. The good side of this is that this gives us variety. It enables us to connect to the rest of the world, particularly our member association in different parts of the world, and the industry which we truly represent. And on that note, I'm delighted in our usual manner to actually introduce our president, Bill Howard from United States, who continuously, and I use the word continuously, get up very early in the morning and actually join us. And he has not mixed any of the webinar. I've missed one. So he put me real to shame. So Bill, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Nelson. And first of all, I would like to once again thank you, Nelson, and the Secretariat for putting together these webinars, which we have found to be very, very successful. They're well attended. They're well attended in person, and a number of people to use YouTube to listen in to the dialogue, after we've conducted the webinar. So they've all been very successful, and they've allowed FIDIC to reach out to more than 15,000 people around the world, our fellow stakeholders, and it really is has been very beneficial. So I thank you very much for doing that. I'd also like to thank the speakers today for participating with us in this very, very important problem that the world now needs to address. This is a very important subject, as we all know, in the area of integrity. Many of us have read dialogue or papers here and there that indicate the magnitude of just the corruption alone problem related to integrity is in the trillions of dollars. If we had that money to spend in a more productive manner, we could really put a dent into the infrastructure problems that we have, which remain underfunded. So we really need to very seriously get at the corruption element of integrity, which is a huge problem. We've got to solve it because, frankly, we need the investment money, and it's awful to be wasting so much money while people are suffering from our infrastructure problems, including, as we point out in the State of the World report, still billions of people without adequate access to drinking water and sanitation, people getting sick every year, sometimes for their entire life due to pollution. We've just got to solve this problem. FIDIC is committed to solving it, to working with stakeholders to solve it in at least two big ways. One is we condemn corruption. We have no tolerance for it. The second area that I'd like to just mention quickly is in our FIDIC Academy training programs, including the Certified Consulting Engineer program, which we're launching. That includes a lot on integrity. And we feel that that will help a lot of our engineering firms and our stakeholders like international funding institutions, et cetera, have a better amount of confidence that people who have that certification are in fact, very familiar with the problems of corruption and know some of the techniques to deal with it. So we're very excited about that. We're excited about this program today, and I will stop now. Nelson mentioned that that I have attended every minute of every webinar, but unfortunately that streak will not continue today. I need to leave the webinar about halfway through it, so my apologies for that. But once again, thanks to everyone, and back to you, Nelson.
Thank you very much, Bill, for your leadership comment in that opening speech. I very much welcome that. It is my honor at this point to introduce the real MC for the session. But before I do so, one of the things that I really want to echo, which I think is important from what Bill said, is that people talk about corruption, and the corruption is a big issue that is all over the world. Our industry, because it's fragmented, is allegedly, supposed to be one of the bad players there. But the truth of the matter is, we have a lot more to go. And I do believe that's what our Integrity Management Committee has been doing in FIDIC is absolutely fantastic, producing a number of documents which are absolutely useful for company to look at our own industry from inside out. But more important, we'll be looking at the demand side as much as the supply side. So it's my great honor to introduce you to the MC, who is the chair, newly appointed chair of the FIDIC Integrity Management Committee, Richard Stump. He's not a stranger to FIDIC. He's been in the FIDIC for quite a while. I'm really delighted to have him on board. Richard, the floor is yours.
Great. Nelson and Bill, thank you very much for your kind words and for setting the table for one of the vexing challenges that we have, not just in the engineering and construction sector, but globally today, which is, of course, the fight against corruption. As you heard from our president, from our CEO, certainly we're also joined by our executive committee sponsor, James Mwangi, who's my predecessor on the IMC. We've got an action-packed 90 minutes for you here today, where we're going to talk about many facets of the fight against corruption, why it's important, how you can take part in it, and the need to make it larger than just an individual voice out in the wilderness or out in the darkness fighting against some of these forces that are often very, very challenging. You heard both Bill and Nelson talk about the importance of integrity, and this is an integrity management presentation. But we're going to talk about the three pillars of FIDIC today, which are integrity, quality, and sustainability. And we're going to do that by taking a quick trip around the world. And I want to just kind of set the stage for the speakers that you're going to hear from today, how they're going to address each of the important issues related to corruption. And then we're going to get into a really vibrant discussion on this issue, how we can combat it, and things you can take away from this discussion in order to bring them back to your daily activities and be successful with your business practices, and why this is actually good for business to fight against corruption. So if we can move to the list of our speakers, but before we do that, I'd like to just kind of set the table with a quick poll. You have an opportunity to choose one of 5 options, and just let us know real briefly, what are the areas where you've experienced the greatest amount of corrupt activity in the infrastructure project lifecycle? This gives us a little bit of feedback from all of you, all of the attendees that we have with us today, in terms of where you're seeing those challenges, and that helps the Integrity Management Committee know where we can start to focus some of our efforts to help put tools on the table that are going to allow you to be successful. So we'll leave it open for maybe just a few seconds longer, and we'll get our results here shortly. So make sure that you go ahead and click on one of those items, submit your response, and we'll see here shortly what all of us on the call or on the webinar here today, this morning, this afternoon, this evening, around the world. So it looks like overwhelmingly that we've got a big challenge in how our construction contractor services are being procured. And I'm glad to hear that this is something of interest and concern, and then in the execution of construction, because that very neatly sets us up for one of the important things that you're going to hear about today, which is a success story in how a government agency protected itself against corruption and was able to successfully procure construction contractors' services, and how the system works. So here's the story arc that we're going to follow over the next 85 minutes in terms of our speakers. We're going to start in Australia. You'll hear from Lyndon White. He's going to talk about the importance of standing up to corruption on a project, how to recognize it, and how to make your voice heard. We're going to then start moving across the globe. We'll end up in Europe. You'll hear from Ahmed Stiffy. He's going to talk about not just engaging against corruption, but just how it affects sustainability and some tools that can be used in the fight against corruption to keep projects sustainable and successful. Again, moving to the idea of the three pillars of FIDIC: integrity, quality, and sustainability. We'll then have an opportunity to hear from Aisha Nadar. She's based in Sweden. She's going to make a business case for all of us as to why collective action against corruption is really important and is something that should be considered rather than going it alone. Then we'll have an opportunity to hear from speakers in Liberia. You'll hear from Shaka Dennis and James Pierre. They're going to present to you the business case for anti-corruption as a project, as part of procurement, and they'll tell you how it's been successful in the Millennium Challenge account in Liberia. And then finally, we'll move across the globe to Canada, and you'll hear from John Ritchie, our final speaker, before we go into Q&A. And John's going to make a modest proposal in terms of looking outside of the engineering and construction sector to other industries who may have been tackling this challenge of corruption in a different way. What can we learn from them, and how can we help make ourselves more successful in that combating fight against corruption? So with that, I'd like to then turn the floor over to our first speaker, to Lyndon White. And Lyndon, thanks for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Richard. Okay, so it's pretty obvious why we're all here, and one of the things that we all hear about as part of this webinar, and we've all heard about it in some way in our working life, is corruption or corrupt conduct. We're not always in a position to identify it, record it, or report it to those who we need to report to. And this could be as a result of absence of policies, procedures, and systems, or sometimes it's about an actual or perceived threat of your own job loss, or sometimes physical harm. The UN put out a convention against corruption in the early 2000s, which is ratified by 187 of 193 countries. And what they said that they wanted to do with that convention against corruption is to wipe out an insidious plague that has a wide range of corrosive effects on societies. And that was all part of the introduction to this webinar. FIDIC has a commitment to standing up to corruption and dealing with it. But I think the most important thing that I've found over my career is that no one should feel disempowered or discouraged from reporting corrupt conduct or corruption, because there's a lot more smaller fish out there rather than the bigger fish like we hear with Panama Papers or the Enron collapse. Ultimately, if we can define corrupt conduct, and it's not necessarily an easy thing to do, of what and when to report, who to report it to, then people that are involved in engineering and infrastructure projects are more likely to come forward and talk about what's going on. As a general statement, corrupt conduct is, pretty apparent to most people what it manifests in and what it consists of. But sometimes there's some subtleties around that as well. And it could be as simple as someone not being honest about a particular matter or a thing. Sometimes it's a misuse or misrepresentation of facts, information, or data. And then it also manifests, and I think this was picked up in the poll before, things like recurring use of one organisation or company, supplier, or an agent for a particular circumstance or engagement. And then when you broaden out to close personal and non-business relationships among contracting parties, you start to get the feeling that corrupt conduct is manifesting in many areas, and it's not just defined to one area or one thing that we can define very simply. Sometimes that corrupt conduct can go unnoticed or unreported because of its subtlety, or because it's not reported or recorded in a way that someone can pick up that evidence and look at the evidence and say it has enough detail. If we can define corrupt conduct well enough in projects and infrastructure and engineering works, we may be able to firstly mitigate the effects of that corrupt conduct and corruption. And then secondly, if we can drive hard enough, we can prevent it if it's yet to occur. So my view is that corrupt conduct causes corruption. And arguably, without that corrupt conduct, there is no corruption. Many countries have legal systems and courts to promote and place judgments there that we can all look at to say, you know, how does this work and how are people penalised with it? Yet it's the big stories that come out. And I think that one of the key points that we should be focusing in on is, even though each individual is only one voice, we've seen over the last couple of decades that when the one and the two and then the groups of people speak out about things that are insidious, things start to change. As an example, when I started my career in the last century, if I can put it that way, the 1980s was about change. And one of the things I recall from my working life there was about how the health and safety movement started in earnest in the 1980s and moved through the 1990s to the point where in the 2000s and onwards, everyone goes to work and plans for work and comes home for work in a safe manner. Well, that's the premise. I don't think it's too dissimilar with trying to define corrupt conduct and record and report corruption. It's about everyone doing their job. It's about everyone focusing on what needs to happen on a daily basis. Occasionally, there's difficulty in doing that, and I can see some of the comments coming up from the participants talking about this particular topic. Sometimes it's not as easy to record and report corrupt conduct. And I've mentioned on that before that sometimes it's not even safe to do that. But it is in there in everyone's working life that we should be able to do that without fear. Touching on what FIDIC can do, one of the most effective ways that corruption can be addressed is at the levels where there's a frequency of relatively small monetary values and transactions occurring. You know, it happens on the job, and the FIDIC has a guidelines for integrity management in the consulting industry called FIMS, available on the FIDIC website, and it has a step-by-step guide to a process that results in a commitment to policies, procedures, resources, regardless of the size of the project or the firm or the organisation that people are working in. And what the FIMS is working towards is, as an industry, defining corrupt conduct and corruption in a manner where there's tools available for people to identify, record, report corrupt conduct and corruption. And critically, the supporting evidence needs to be detailed enough so that when you're trying to put the evidence forward to those that you need to report to, that it is credible. Now, there's obviously things that you can use in place like the FIMS, but there's a question that arises as well, which is that what happens if my organisation or the people I work with just don't have the policies or procedures in place? Well, the first thing is don't panic. It's about just thinking about what's going on, organise the way that you think about things, critically analyse what's going on around you as well. But you're not alone, and I've talked about that already, that the lone voice can do much good work. And there's resources like the Bribery Prevention Network, a really great resource that's online, and it asks questions like, what should I do if my organisation doesn't have an anti-bribery program, for example? Or that someone is working in a country that is prone to bribery and corruption, what red flags should they look for? Other organisations like Transparency International have interesting articles and guidance and information. There's other initiatives like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative to improve transparency around extractive industries around the world. Other resources like the sanctions lists that are available from Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, the PNG Sanctions Secretariat, for example, and the Australian government are really instrumental in trying to give people enough information, enough resource, so that when they're looking into recording and reporting corruption, that they're not alone. One day that occurs every year that's promoted by the UN and many organisations is the 9th of December, which is the International Anti-Corruption Day. And although it's not just one day that we should strive not to be corrupt or do something important about preventing corruption, it should serve as a benchmark for people to strive to, so that you can check your initiatives over a particular time frame and then try and develop that so that it's a little bit more enduring each time. Of course, with everything that goes on in a webinar, everything that goes on around a particular topic, there's got to be this ultimate question, which is, yes, that's great information. Yes, we can do lots of things, but now what? What should we do next? Well, my view is that we should always step forward rather than step back, only if it's safe to do so, though. If you feel like you're in some sort of danger, or that recording and reporting isn't possible at the time when you're observing it or when you're becoming aware of it, then collect your thoughts and do it after that. The FIDIC FIMS provides a good basis for a systemic approach to providing policies and procedures. The 9th of December provides an opportunity to check in. And if nothing else, just create yourself a simple checklist about the who, the what, the where, the when, the how, the why, and then what to do about it next. If we can gradually work towards individuals recording and reporting what it is in relation to corrupt conduct, then we've got a better chance of addressing corruption. Thank you, Richard.
Lyndon, thank you very much for kind of laying out the reasons for taking action with regards to corruption and not letting it slide. So having heard from Lyndon, let's move over to Germany and let's hear from Ahmed. And Ahmed's going to give us some information about sustainability and the tool of lean construction and how that can help us in the fight against corruption. So Ahmed, the floor is now yours.
Well, thank you, Richard, again. And yeah, it is great to be here with you today. And I will try, as you introduced, to link the construction or corruption in construction with the sustainability. And sustainability is also an important as corruption topics in our time. And when we talk about it or discuss it in the context of any conversation, we must refer actually to the Sustainable Development and the 2030 agenda of the UN. So, as is well known, the 2030 agenda defines the path and goals for sustainability. And no one from you, from the attendance, disagrees with the negative impact of corruption in reaching these goals. But since we belong to the construction industry, or most of us today in this webinar belong to the engineering and construction industry, what we are interested in today is to discussing corruption within our sector and seeing its impact actually in sustainability. So in this next few minutes, I will focus with you on corruption in construction and its impact on the sustainability. So let me start actually with the most frequently quoted definition for sustainable development. Is it a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability for future generation? Yeah, it is well now from our Common Future report. So it has, for us, that mean it has two components, actually, the concept of needs and the idea of limitation. It is very important to understand this both concept and link it later on to the corruption forms. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, adopted actually in 2015. It is not, we work actually in FIDIC. Sustainability is, let's say, a founded and foundational value for FIDIC from 1913. Okay, we can see the gap in this term. So the agenda actually has 17 goals, including 169 targets. But the question which we should ask ourselves, is corruption considered in the agenda itself? Looking inside all the reports and targets of the 2030 agenda, the answer is yes. In goal number 16, under target 5, 16.5, peace, justice, and strong institution, sustainability reduce, I quote, sustainability reduce corruption and bribery in all their forms. So it is only goal that explicitly refer to corruption, which is for us actually not enough. Of course, this is true, sustainability and what it achieves from fighting poverty and spreading peace and democracy can reduce the corruption. But what matters to us here today, actually to look from the other side and see the impact of corruption in our industry in sustainability, and not the impact of sustainability and corruption. So to do that, the first step is here to map the role of the construction sector or construction activity in the 2030 agenda and its development process. Many studies show that 74 of the 169 targets of the agenda, which is approximately 44%, were found to be dependent on the construction industry. It shows again the importance of our industry in the sustainable development. 29 of these 74 targets, which means 17%, are directly dependent on the in the construction industry, and 45 is about 27% is indirectly dependent. I try to give here one example. For example, the Sustainable Development Target number 11, sustainable cities and communities, and the target number 6, clean water and sanitation, are directly linked to the construction industry, which means achieving these targets requires upgrading and constructing new infrastructure, facilities, and transportation, and use of building materials that don't contribute to the groundwater contamination. So it was only 2 examples now, which show the impact of our construction industry in the sustainable development. Therefore, I would say we are not exaggerating if we say that the fighting corruption within the construction sector is key factor in the success of the agenda and realization of the sustainability. It is not, but again, it is not secret that the corruption is widely spread in the construction sector, a fact confirmed from all reports and indicators covering corruption as phenomenon. For example, the Brewer Buyer Index, published from the Transparency International London, mentioned it before, ranked the construction with a score of 5.3 from 10 as the most corrupt sector of all economic sectors. We have to take care. The global construction market was assumed in 2025 to be $15,000 billion, and the cost of corruption assumed to be $1,500 billion, which is 10%. 10% from our industry is as a waste of corruption. So, once corruption and its visible forms, causes, consequences, challenges, and sensitivities has been understood, it is important to recognize the barriers for an effective response. And in this regard, it is essential to look for a solution to eliminate or to at least mitigate the effect of corruption, as well as the repetition of similar cases. We have, you mentioned that John will give us, or Aisha will give us some examples later on. It is important that we make sure that such cases will not be repeated. And from my expertise, let's say, as example for fighting corruption in the construction industry, additional to the tools and policies included in speech of from London, I actually use a lean construction as a new management philosophy in the construction sector. The lean construction can really play a role in bridging the results from the theory to the practice, helping to understand the reason behind this problem without staying in the past. It's very important, which is essential to overcome the bad experiences. So I would like to emphasize that an important point, again, that corruption in its different forms and types has been an old and tricky means to sustainable development. But that is a message for all of us. It is crucial to keep in mind that it is possible to tackle it through its uses and consequences, as well as finding solution for its prevention. Prevention is very important concept to combat corruption, actually. And that is a main concept in FIMS. And fostering a positive mindset through knowledge represents actually a gateway for change and success. We all need to know about these topics. The webinar today is one example of this as a source of power to combat it. And I see my time is run now. I will say, don't forget, one small positive thought in the morning can change your whole day. Thank you.
Great. Ahmed, thank you very much for the summary and reminder of the importance of combating corruption as we work towards the UN sustainability goals. And now it's time to move again within Europe to Sweden, and I'd like to set the table for Aisha Nadar, who is going to again present a business case as it relates to fighting corruption. So Aisha, the floor is now yours.
Yes, my computer told me I was muted. So thank you, Richard, and thank you, Ahmed, for pointing out the impact or the negative impact that corruption has on development, and that it can in fact be a major obstacle to obtaining the aspiration that we all have of sustainable development and building back better. As we know, corruption in all its forms can have extremely negative political, social, and even economic effects. Corruption can be an obstacle to economic development, and it can hinder finding investment in infrastructure. It can also lead to citizens losing trust in their governments. And ultimately, it could even undermine peace and endanger stability in the world. So it is no insignificant subject that we are talking about, and it's no wonder that this is the highest registration of any seminar or any webinar in the FIDIC webinar series that was launched by the Secretariat when we went into the COVID lockdown. So fighting corruption is really a collective responsibility. Fighting corruption in our industry, be that of the engineering consulting, is even more critical today as we try and build back better post-COVID, and try and do so while trying to avoid exacerbating the negative effects of a K-shaped economic recovery. So it is true, as Lyndon has pointed out, that the international community has adopted several conventions to fight corruption, and they've been doing so for many, many years. And many nation states have enacted laws to promote the prevention of corruption, or to require firms to actually institute active and passive, the prevention of active and passive corruption. As far back as 1979, we all remember the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States, which was then followed by many. It's also true that some private sector companies have started realizing the adverse effects of corruption on their economic viability. And while certain private firms have been engaging and demonstrating leadership in promoting anti-corruption techniques, they're facing challenges that they cannot go alone. For example, they're not successful in and of themselves in eliminating the facilitation of payments or creating a level playing field. So while action on a global level, on a nation state level is important, and while action by a single company is also important, that the final impact is limited. So it is against this backdrop that I propose to address the business case for collective action in the engineering and construction sector. But first, I start with what I mean by collective action. The notion of collective action is one that brings together parties who together seek to achieve more tangible and longer lasting results, and do so with a focus of fighting corruption. The result of pooling together the skills and expertise will be greater than the individual efforts by a few acting alone or in disparate parts without connection. The whole will be greater than the sum of the parts, I would argue. So collective action by multiple actors across the entire spectrum of the engineering construction sector can help ensure that all players in the industry, even the small firms, will understand the need, the importance of fighting corruption, and will have access to the tools to implement systems that will help them to do so. But they'll be able to have access to these tools while the cost of developing such tools will be shared across the industry. This type of action, this type of collective action, will help not only fight corruption, but it will also help promote a level playing field in our industry. We've all been faced with the issue. If we don't facilitate payment, we might not get the contract. And in a competitive environment without a level playing field, it's very difficult at times to make the right choice. Or as Lyndon said, if you see something, to say something, because you want to keep your job. So the concept of collective action isn't new. It's worked across many sectors, across the law, but it does take time, and it takes investment of expertise. But more importantly, it takes collaboration. So it takes an objective, creating an objective and shifting the view from fighting corruption through disqualification and blacklisting, but creating a paradigm shift and shifting to rewarding good behavior and whitelisting. From this, we all know I often like this fighting corruption. If we don't do a collective collaborative approach, we will face the prisoner's dilemma. And the prisoner's dilemma is a standard example of a game in game theory that shows why two completely rational individuals might not cooperate, even if it's in their best interest. So you have to have that overall guiding hand. You can't just disseminate information without creating and facilitating a collaborative environment. And the business case for collective action in a collaborative environment will be creating a more level playing field in which for construction and engineering firms to compete and to get business. It will improve the public trust. And it will actually improve the industry's ability to engage governments and to change laws such that we can have a stronger impact. So with that, I turn it back to you, Richard.
Great. Aisha, thank you very much for the demonstration of the need for collective action and the importance of a level playing field, of a collaborative environment where there's trust and integrity in the institutions that are responsible for procuring these projects, which, as Ahmed mentioned, are designed to move us towards a more sustainable future. I'd like us to now move to Liberia. Let's hear about an example of proven strategy that was well executed and worked to tackle this exact topic that you've heard Lyndon and Ahmed and Aisha talk about. So I'll turn things over to Shaka and to James, and let's hear about the Millennium Challenge account and what they've done in Liberia to be very, very successful with procurement of construction work with high integrity. Shaka and James.
Okay, thanks a lot, Rich. First, I'll just touch on three things. One, I'll give you a quick overview of the Millennium Challenge account. Then Councillor Pierre will talk about our anti-fraud and corruption plan. And then I'll give you a case study. So the Millennium Challenge account is an organization, autonomous agency set up by the US government and the government of Liberia to administer a $257 million grant from the United States government through the Millennium Challenge Corporation out of Washington, DC. And this program was designed to alleviate poverty through addressing two binding constraints. One binding constraint is reliable and affordable electricity, and the second one is inadequate road infrastructure. So here at MCAL, we don't have a big group. We have about 36 persons. We also have an external consultant who's our procurement agent, another external consultant who's our fiscal agent. We procure everything, all goods and services, and consultants and contractors, vendors from all around the world bid on these projects. So with that, I'll turn it over to Councillor Jimmy Pierre, and he'll tell you how we set up our anti-fraud and corruption plan. And then I'll give you an example when I come back on how we used it to combat potential fraud and corruption. So Jimmy?
Thanks, Shaka. As Shaka noted, MC Liberia is a government Liberian entity that is funded by the United States government, specifically Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC for short. MCC has a policy on preventing, detecting, and remediating fraud and corruption, which MC Liberia is required to comply. And one of these requirements is the creation of an anti-fraud and corruption action plan. We use, which is AFC for short. This action plan, MC Liberia's approach to this action plan is more to treat it as a project that needs to be implemented just as the construction works needs to be implemented. And Lyndon mentioned it during his presentation that in the vein that Lyndon mentioned, MC Liberia treats anti-fraud and corruption, the implementation of it, just as important toward an infrastructure project as the health and safety measures. So MC Liberia, the CEO, has appointed an internal team, which is pretty much a project management team to develop and implement the AFC action plan. So this starts with, and let me just say that MC Liberia develops this action plan in conjunction with MCC. So the internal team, they meet with the project leads for the various projects and to discuss the potential corruption from every level of the project, from the development of TOR to the procurement phase to the project implementation, and then from the construction followed by the defects period. So this information feeds into AFC risk assessment matrix. And from this matrix, we pull out the highest risk, because the purpose of the matrix is to identify the lower risk, the medium risk, and highest risk. The highest risk are placed into the AFC action plan. And this is the plan which the internal team is responsible to implement, because when you have an internal team they're responsible to implement, they own it and they are held accountable to make sure that it's implemented. So this plan is approved by MC Liberia, MCC reviews it, and it's approved by the MC Liberia board. Our board, being that we're a government entity, it's comprised of the ministers who are in the two sectors that MC Liberia has projects, primarily roads and energy. And the chairman of our board is the Minister of Finance. So the board approves this. The board approves the AFC action plan, and after it's approved, then we go about implementing it. The implementation, to make sure that the AFC action plan isn't just aren't just words on paper. We are held accountable to report to the senior management and to the board periodically on how it's implemented. So that allows the action plan to become part of MC Liberia's culture. And once it becomes part of your culture, the outside persons who may be inclined to participate in fraud or corrupt activities will be disinclined to approach you if they know that's part of your culture. So with that being said, I'll now turn it back to Shaka for him to provide a case study on how we're able to combat a potential case of fraud and corruption.
Okay, so Rich, in 2018, we developed a request for bids for one of our signature projects, which is a 5-kilometer, 1,200 diameter, 48-inch raw water transmission pipeline. This was a design build, FIDIC Yellow Book, $18 million construction cost. We flew in technical experts, individual consultants from around the world who sat in on the evaluation panel. They were the evaluation panel. Nobody on the MCA was part of that panel to evaluate the bids. So after being sequestered for a couple of weeks, they make a recommendation on the award. That recommendation is then reviewed internally by senior management, the fiscal agent, the procurement agent. It's also then sent to the Millennium Challenge account in Washington, DC for no objection. Then it comes back, and it also is approved by our board. So this pipeline, which runs from the hydropower plant to the water treatment plant, as I said, it's about 5 kilometers. It's a very key project. We had, in this case, one of the firms that was not, the firm that was not awarded the project, there were several firms, but one of them decided to go ahead and start lobbying some of the ministers in the government. Contrary to their knowledge, most of these key ministers are on our board. They bought off on the AFC plan. They were trained by the AFC plan. So basically, we were able to circumvent that type of behavior from the get-go, because the very same people that they were trying to lobby and talk to are the people who were involved in developing the anti-fraud and corruption plan. So basically, their attempts were mostly dead in the water. But that's a classic example. The project was awarded in 2019, and the project was completed in January of this year. So that was a successful project. Thank you.
Jacques and Jimmy, thank you very much for demonstrating how your organization, how the MCA was able to successfully put together a plan of action and execute it in a way that combated corruption and allowed some badly needed infrastructure to contribute to the development for a sustainable future in Liberia. So having heard about how things have worked in Africa, we're going to now focus to Canada, to our last speaker, John Ritchie. John's going to look at some opportunities outside of the engineering and construction sector and learn from others. And John, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Richard. Great privilege to participate in this webinar. I'd like to step back on the issue of collective action and talk about what are the various forms of collective action that can be taken. And as Aisha has mentioned, collective action is something that individual stakeholders can take. The positive side of that is that collective action can be initiated by people who consider it to be a major problem, but they're operating outside the ambit of the decision makers in government. So the key thing with collective action, of course, is to motivate government to make some changes, to encourage changes. So it can be initiated at any location by any group of stakeholders, and that's why I would encourage people to think about this and decide if there is a merit to initiating any form of collective action. It can be used to attract support from governments and law enforcement and exert pressure on them to play their part more effectively. Now, when you look at what form collective action can take, I suggest they can take they can be classified in 5 broad categories, ranging from relatively passive collective action to very active collective action. The education and awareness training programs from local to international would be the relatively passive kind of collective action. They can be very useful in highlighting issues and educating people. The next level is development and promotion of anti-corruption tools. And we'll talk about an example of that. Then the next level up is agreement among bribe payers, quote unquote, to refrain from participating in corruption and having some rigor to their commitment. And then international financiers and event sponsors to establish integrity frameworks for their projects. We've heard of the example in Liberia on the MCA example. And then lastly, active participation by civil society in government procurement and monitoring of infrastructure projects. An example of that is the Cost Infrastructure Transparency Initiative. Now, FIDIC began collective action over 20 years ago, and personally, I've been involved in a lot of that, developing flexible integrity management tools that are tailored to the needs of the industry. And FIDIC advocates the adoption of the FIDIC Integrity Management System, or FIMS, by all firms in the industry. And then recently, the Integrity Management Committee adopted a more rigorous approach and advocated firms that have already developed their FIMS to become certified to the ISO anti-bribery standard, or ISO 37001. But we know, unfortunately, corruption in the engineering construction industry remains a significant problem. And to be fair, the adoption of FIMS among engineering firms has been less than hoped. So my question is, could we do more? And does this specific example of something called the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network provide a useful example of a more determined anti-corruption initiative? Now, a little bit of information about the MACN. It's a cooperative network that incorporates most of the world's major shipping lines. It has 140 members representing 50% of world tonnage. MACN members are empowered by the confidential exchange of information on demands for bribes at various ports. This allows individual members to develop strategies to avoid paying bribes and initiate projects to address specific problem areas. So some key facts about MACN. It was founded in 2011, and safety and profitability were major drivers. One of the people that is a colleague of mine here in Vancouver was involved in establishing it. He characterizes the situation as a burning platform. They had a big problem, and the problem was such that ships were sitting idle, waiting for clearance through the major canals of the world, and it was cartons of cigarettes all the way up to major bribes. They considered the situation to be out of control. So the MACN was formed with the 140 members. Major companies that you will all recognize, they are members, Maersk, NYK, Seaspan, China Navigation, Costco, Hapag-Lloyd. These are major companies who have decided that they will join together and commit to avoiding corruption in their industry. So they have regular meetings where confidential information is exchanged. They maintain a secretariat, which is capable of fielding confidential queries and confidential information. And then going beyond that, they work in partnership with local authorities to develop solutions to specific problems. And one of the areas that they have been successful is in the major port in Nigeria, working together with stakeholders to develop an understanding of the problem and realistic ways of tackling them. So the MACN is considered to be a success story. The website of the MACN is very simple, macn.dk. It's based in Denmark. That's where the Secretariat is based. So a question for the panel and for those participating, is it time for the engineering construction industry to decide to adopt such a program? What would be required to make it work? What changes from the MACN approach would be necessary? Can it work for our industry? Or is it just, do we just not have sufficient commitment of the key players? Would we see people breaking ranks? There are major potential problems. I certainly acknowledge that. I think you have to have commitment. You have to have publicity. The members need to be known. You need to have confidential exchange of information. And you need to be in a position to portray your group to the world as being something that is different, that seeks to change the way we do business. So I'd like to throw that out to the other panelists and to those who are in the audience to discuss how this might work and whether it would work. And if so, what role should FIDIC play in establishing? Thank you.
John, thank you very much for setting up kind of a challenge and throwing down the gauntlet to the engineering and construction industry, which would be, is it time for a change? Is it time to do something different? And in watching the questions that have come up in the chat bar, I can see some of the very similar lines of thinking by some of the participants who are on the line with us. And I'm going to take your question and I'm going to weld it to one comment that one of our participants has made. And Aisha, I'm going to direct this question to you. So John has said, how do we, is it time for a change, and what would that change look like? And I'm going to take what one of our participants has said, which is, I've been in this industry for 40 years. There's been a lot of talk. There's been a lot of paperwork generated, but I don't see much change on the ground. So Aisha, if John is saying, here's one way we could change, and we have a lot of people that say, we're not making many progress, how can collective action move us forward? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think what I find oftentimes what prevents change is fear, lack of understanding, and lack of access. And I think where collective action can help, it reduces the transaction cost of information. We're in the COVID age. Everything's digital. We all sit on our whatever chair and travel the world. Well, we could use that as an opportunity for the reduced access to information costs, and we could use that as a collaborative platform to engage our stakeholders, because we have to seek out what's preventing them from engaging, and also give them the tools to how to do this effectively. Because many of, particularly in the consulting engineering industry, many of the firms are a firm-sized group of one. And they don't have the time to go research that information or to develop the tools or to conduct the training. So to make that readily available to that group. Then to work with the others that have the resources, the very large consulting engineering firms, and also to work across the industry. We're no longer segmented as an industry. I think traditionally design was separated from construction and the professional groups and the construction groups and all of that. Today, it is a bit more seamless, and the world is connected, and we are only as strong as the weakest link. So we have to work and invest with our partner organizations. So as John mentioned, we can look to what areas have worked well, copy, imitate, but do that, I think, through FIDIC has a place here, because individual firms don't have the luxury of creating a collaborative environment. There's a bit of a competition between them. So I think FIDIC as a platform can bring together the multilateral development banks, the institutions, the information, the UN publications that were talked about, that Lyndon talked about earlier, the different possibilities, for example, the one that John mentioned, and look at how do we bridge the gap, and also engage the small firms and see what they're thinking and engage those so I would argue that we need to facilitate, reduce the transaction costs of access to information, and help everybody in a collaborative environment. Because when I talked about the prisoner's dilemma, if you don't have a facilitator to create collaboration, we will not collaborate. I mean, you know, the game theory, I didn't create it. It just is. So how do we overcome the game theory, and how do we overcome the transaction cost? And I would argue that FIDIC is well positioned to start investigating both.
Great. Aisha, thank you. Any reactions from our other panelists to Aisha's comments?
I think one of the comments there, Richard, is that regardless of size of the firm, we have to apply some sort of principles that, and we develop things that can be utilized by everyone. If we have something that is only pointing to one end of town, it can never be universal.
Right. So Lyndon, to that point, I want to take what Aisha said in your comments, and I'm going to weld into a comment from one of our participants, and I'm going to direct this one to Jimmy and to Shaka. There's been a lot of interesting comments in the chat bar of, and questions about how your procurement strategy worked. So, and Aisha's talking about, well, hey, we need to lower the bar for information. And Lyndon is talking about the fact that, there's an opportunity for us to be working together, getting that access to information. With regard to the transparency of your procurement process, how did you make sure that all of the agencies or the contractors who were involved, how were they made aware of how the process would work? And then maybe what would you say were one or two of the key lessons you've learned that if you were going to do this again, that you might advise somebody to build a similar program to replicate your success?
Well, let me take a stab at this, and then I'll let Jimmy come in. But on this particular project, which was this pipeline design build with FIDIC Yellow Book, we knew was going to be highly charged and very competitive, looking at the market. So, I mean, in general, our procurement process is handled by our procurement director, and then we have an outside procurement agent, which is an outside firm that kind of overlooks and provides the quality control for our procurement department. Then you also have the Millennium Challenge Corporation. They have also their procurement director, which also overlooks the whole process. We advertise everything. Everything is above board. It's and on that particular project, I think talking to the CEO, myself, internally with Jimmy, we realized that it's not in our best interest here at MCA for any of us to be on the evaluation panel. That's number one, because we knew it was going to be politically, you'll have people coming after you for trying to influence you, whether in your personal life, outside of MCA. So with that in mind, we definitely opted for using a technical evaluation panel that's made up of outside experts. We have a pool of consultants who we had already procured, and we have open contracts with them. So we flew in people from the US, South Africa, no conflict of interest with any of the bidders. We make them sign all these forms and verify that and sequester them and let them do an independent evaluation, very transparent of the bid. So that's one of the things that helps a whole lot. Of course, in the AFC plan, as I mentioned, to have the key people in the government who serve on our board and people who are stakeholders also be trained in the AFC, in our AFC plan. And by the way, the AFC plan is on our website, so anybody can go up there and download it. The procurement process and what we use, the procurement manual, it's on our website. So it's all there. So that's one of the key things I would say. So Jimmy, but Rich, we had more than one. I just use that example, but I know for those who have sat in this seat and had to put out bids, it's very stressful sometimes because we had more than one project where people tried to go around you, under you, over you. I mean, they tried every kind of way. But once you have a solid plan in place, I mean, it's very difficult because the same people they're trying to lobby and influence are the ones who develop the plan. So they're basically, they just have to go away. I think one of the questions we had was what happened to the firm that tried to lobby for this project? It just kind of faded away because there's nothing they could do, just mumble and groan and just fade away. That's it. Jimmy?
Yeah, just to follow up what you talked about, Shaka, just as MC Liberia is required to follow, to comply with MCC's policies on remediating fraud and corruption, MC Liberia also has to comply with MCC's procurement rules. It's called the PPGs, the Program Procurement Guidelines. So those PPGs, they lay out all the requirements that MC Liberia is required to follow. And so in terms of the advertising and sharing of information, if we don't do it, MCC holds us to the fire. Like they have strong oversight over our actions. So I think in that sense, perhaps it may not be like MC Liberia is a unique organization that perhaps other organizations would not be able to mirror. But I think just the idea that anti-fraud and corruption is imbued in MC Liberia as part of our culture and is something that's reinforced on a daily basis. It's not just something that's on paper. It's something that it has to be implemented, and there's accountability for lack of implementation. I think that is something that could be sent out and used in other organizations.
Great.
Just to add to what Jimmy is saying, it's very important for the senior leadership in an organization to be the champions of the anti-fraud and corruption plan, because if it doesn't start from the top, it's not gonna work.
And Shaka, that's a really important point. Looking at one of the comments that is sitting in the chat bar, where we've got a participant who says, "Well, what do you do if you're the only person in the organization that's fighting against the corrupt practices? What happens then?" And it seems like all the cards are stacked against you. Lyndon, you brought this up at the beginning of your presentation about the need to not try to go it alone. Can you talk a little bit about this? And then John Ritchie, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this as well, because I know you've had some tough challenges in your career dealing with corrupt initiatives that you experienced. So let's hear from both of you gentlemen.
Yeah, well, I think, Richard, that if philosophically, if you're the one voice in an entire organization that is talking about it and everyone else wants to hide it, there might be an issue there that you need to get away from it. But having said that, if it's more as a matter of total misunderstanding that people within the organization aren't following the leads and are just thinking that this is part of ordinary business, and I know that in some cultures and in some dialects that there is no word for corruption. So it might be hard for people to actually define that. And then that lone voice starts to, gain some momentum by talking about it more often. It's just a matter of, and I see in the comments in the last couple of minutes, there's more about education, about, you know, indoctrinating people into the thought of, hang on, does this smell right? Does it taste right? Does it look right? Does it feel right? And back to one of Aisha's comments before, it reminded me of a project where the catchphrase was see something, say something, do something. So I think that that's the general underlying mantra, is that you've got to commit to it. And if you're the lone voice, don't give up.
Great. Thanks, Lyndon. John, your thoughts on the same issue, just a different perspective, perhaps.
Yeah, I think all of us have encountered the corruption issue, and I think one of the most important things is to feel that you're not alone in objecting to it, and there's where collective action comes in. If you build a consensus within your industry that corruption needs to be addressed and dealt with, and you develop a knowledge base, and then you disseminate that knowledge base through your company, you then have a basis for ensuring that gradually your company will move away from it. But as Aisha has said, there has to be a business case. You have to be able to demonstrate that taking action against corruption or standing against corruption is going to benefit your company. And one of the things that we're talking about within the Integrity Management Committee is putting forward the view to our members that if you want to build a firm that is at the top of the food chain, it needs to be a firm that operates with integrity. And if you are going to be at the bottom of the food chain and always competing on cost, you're not going to be a successful firm. So the business case really is important. Developing the knowledge base and the understanding of that principle, I think, is very important.
Great. John, that's a really astute observation as it relates to, again, the business case and the value of doing so. There was a comment in the chat bar that related to just the education, which you know, both you and Lyndon talked about it, as well as Aisha, which is, why doesn't FIDIC work at a local chapter level? And this is an interesting comment because we do have over 100 member associations around the world, which are designed to provide you with that direct local resource. Actually, what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask our executive committee member and previous Integrity Management Committee chair, James Mwangi, to talk about what that member association looks like in Kenya, seeing as how Kenya has been extremely well represented on this this webinar. And James, tell us a little bit about member associations, how they work, and how our practitioners can take advantage of their MAs.
Thank you very much, Richard. And let me take the opportunity to thank the speakers for what they've said so far and contributed, and also to recognize those who are putting up questions on the chat. As mentioned by Aisha, I think the concept of collective action means that you're getting together because you have common issues, you have common challenges, and you're recognizing that going it alone is obviously has limitations, has limited impact, has limited benefit. In FIDIC, we have membership through membership associations. And in my country, we have the Association of Consulting Engineers. And what has happened is that the association is a strong grouping that addresses issues that affect the consulting engineers in Kenya. And then the beauty is that it is aligned to FIDIC. So at a global level, we are aligned in terms of how do we look at the challenges that we are facing, and then what lessons can we draw from other countries, etc. I think the key thing is that the collective action principle or philosophy, I think, is what I see key, because we have been able to move a lot of agenda in Kenya through the membership association. And then on top of that, because membership or consulting engineers are primarily in the private sector, we have then linked up to the private sector apex body or apex voice of the industry, because corruption is a common challenge in the whole of the country. So we align ourselves when it comes to tackling this. And what has happened is the membership associations such as ASEC has been able to collectively bring in the issues or list them. And when we are lobbying government or lobbying change in policy, change in legislation, we are able to embed or at least submit issues that we think will help us enable the consulting engineering practice in our country. And therefore, it has been extremely useful. And we have continued to encourage members to be, we have continued to encourage consulting engineers to be members. And then obviously through training on issues such as the FIDIC integrity management systems, we have been able to further this agenda. We are still not there, but certainly miles ahead when you do things collectively. Thank you, Richard.
Great. James, thanks for helping to just open the aperture as it relates to our member associations and the resources they provide. So, talking about resources and the way that contracts and documents are structured, there was a comment in the chat bar that related to possibly whether or not the FIDIC suite of contracts or some of the documents that are available publicly might encourage corruption in them. And Ahmed, I wanted to ask for your thoughts on this particular issue, as well as just the use of the documents as they relate to sustainability. You've done a lot of research as it relates to the different organizations within not just lean construction, but sustainability in construction. And what are your thoughts as to whether or not a bias like this exists? And if it does exist, how could it be removed? If it doesn't exist, how can we continue to move in a positive direction to keep corruptive bias out of contract documents?
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. Actually, that's what we in the Integrity Management Committee tried in the past. So to work together actually with the contract committee and to include some clauses against corruption in the contract. And that was one of the tools actually used in the lean construction contract as well, alliance or integrated form of delivery. So more if there is no such possibility, what one can do actually, one can use a project code of conduct. This is not only in the organization level. Let us to think smarter and go to the project level. So if you don't have such clauses in your contract in your country, we can actually use some code of conduct in the project level or project documents, let's say. What is actually also important, what I see the next level, this relationship between anti-corruption and sustainability. That what actually Aisha and John also mentioned, this collaboration between the public and private sector. As Aisha mentioned before, FIDIC can place the platform or under the umbrella of FIDIC. And what is important to have such, let's say, clauses include or enhance the transparency and the integrity in the contract itself. Because nowadays we are, as Aisha also again mentioned, we are in the digital transformation of our industry. There will be more integration between technology people and processes. And the companies in the engineering and construction industry should take advantage of this technological innovation to increase transparency and accountability, as said, and enhance the integrity of their staffs and people. For example, I just give or mention one example, the virtual design and construction, including BIM technology, the 3D, 4D, and 5D can obtain reliable quantity estimation and time and budget monitoring, which increases accountability and the transparency. We have to see how to include such terms in our contract. Again, if we remember in the beginning, your first goal, it was about the procurement and the contracting of subcontractor or contractor. The e-procurement can reduce administration and bureaucracy, corruption, and speed up actually the processes without, let's say, facilitation payment, which is a form of corruption. And in lean, from lean, if I come to lean back and give an example, there is what we call on-site vision tracking and GPS support systems offer effective information about the positioning and of machine and personnel. So it can also be used to identify underperformance, and increase the transparency and the accountability. Also, I use it to what we say to measure integrity, if the worker is the equipment in the right place or not. Such thinking, such issues should be really included in our contract. It is benchmarking of the best practice, and we have always to think and how to adopt such tools in our contracts. Thank you.
Great. Ahmed, thank you very much for walking through some of the opportunities within the contracts. And one of the things I wanted to touch upon to move to another topic of importance related to standards is you mentioned facilitation payments and bribery. I want to talk a little bit about anti-bribery. There was a comment in the chat bar related to FIDIC's engagement of ISO standard 37001, which is the anti-bribery standard. And there are 3 individuals on this panel who were involved in authoring one of the FIDIC Integrity Management System documents, which specifically addressed the adoption of ISO 37001. So what I'd like to do, John and Ahmed, as 2 of my co-authors on that document, is to talk a little bit about, is it in FIDIC's best interest or in companies' best interest to get third-party certification for an anti-bribery system, or maybe even talk a little bit about that standard and how people could walk out of this this webinar and find a useful tool in that FIMS 3 document. So John, why don't you start, and then Ahmed, we'll go back to you.
Thanks. So with the ISO 37001 standard only focuses on anti-bribery, whereas the FIDIC Integrity Management System covers more aspects of operating with integrity. But the anti-bribery standard offers an opportunity, if you're certified to it, to present something meaningful to a client like the World Bank or an organization like the World Bank. FIDIC has argued for a long time for creating a whitelist, if you like, of firms that have established their FIMS. But a FIMS can be at varying levels of detail and varying levels of rigor, whereas ISO 37001 is very, very specific. So if you're certified to ISO 37001, it is a credible certification that can allow you to present yourself to your clients and to the world as a company that is committed to operating with integrity. One of the first companies actually to get certified was a company in Mexico that was founded by Felipe Ochoa, who was directly responsible for some of the early initiatives by FIDIC in integrity management. So I'll turn it over back to you, Richard, and then to Ahmed.
Right. Ahmed, your thoughts on that anti-bribery standard and FIM's role with engaging the standard?
Thank you, Richard and John. Yes, it was work of the last 3 years of the Integrity Committee, and we are really pleased of the output. Okay, as John mentioned, it in the ISO, it is only against or anti-bribery. I think the problem is that because there is no an international definition for the corruption itself. Some people see corruption or in its form as bribery, but we have to understand in our industry there is more forms and types for corruption, and this collection of or forms is introduced by FIMS more than in the ISO. So the guidance will help actually the company to implement actually such a system, but in a wider and a better implementation for our own industry. Because we have this, as you mentioned, the facility payment in the planning. We have very important in our FIMS, the conflict of interest It is a core of our FIMS. If you compare it with the ISO standards, yeah, it is a little bit not so good explained for engineering and construction company as in our FIMS. Also the other types of corruption and the policies development. Actually, the FIMS show on step by step how you can develop your let's say integrity management system for your tailored for your company in all sizes. If you are 2 up to 15 person in your company, mid or big size. Also, there is a link between FIMS and compliance program. That is also the bridge. What we advise actually from the integrity management community by FIDIC really to depend on this guidance and see how to implement your ISO or integrity management system in compliance with the regulation in your country.
Great, thank you, Ahmed. And we're coming to the close of our Q&A session, and I would like to ask Aisha to provide just one last thought. We had a couple of questions or comments about CPI indexes and Transparency International. And as someone who's had the opportunity to work in a relatively clean, highly ranked area on the transportation index, what kind of maybe just a parting thought could you leave with some of our participants regarding things that you've seen that have been successful in Scandinavia?
I think what we all have to realize. I've worked a lot in the defense industry and in the construction industry around the globe, and corruption is not reserved to any one geographic location, or one particular culture, or one particular nation state, and it's not excluded from any. I know that Sweden enjoys a high degree of world regard, but we also know that other countries in Europe have experienced corrupt officials, and we won't mention the French at this very juncture, but with Sarkozy. But I think, and that's a very recent example, and it's not mine, it's on the news. I think what we have to realize is that systems, humans are humans, systems help prevent corruption. And creating the transparency, and I very much enjoyed listening to Chaka and James about translating aspirations into obligations and checkpoints and verification. And if you just continue along the line of aspirations that we wish we will eradicate corruption, we will always continue to wish and never get there. But we have to take those aspirations and translate them into obligations that are verifiable and demonstratable. And I think that the case study of having the constituents that are involved building the system so that they have buy-in and they know what the system is and they know what the obligations are, such that when someone comes to them and says, can I take you to dinner? Or can I do this? Or can I do that? They know they have the ability to see something, smell something, do something, and they know that the plan of action, and they know they're going to be listened to, and they know they will not be the only voice, only lonely voice. So that's what I would say. It isn't humans. It is the humans collectively combining to create the systems that give us the strength that John had mentioned, to not be alone and to have the power of collectiveness and a system backing you, that if you stand up, you will be supported in your standing up, as opposed to being hammered because you're on the wrong side of the deal.
Great. Aisha, thank you. And thank you for laying that out and talking about checkpoints. So we have one last checkpoint before we go into our final close up and wrap up and listen to, again, our EC sponsor, James Wanji, and then of course our CEO, Nelson Ogunchakun. So a last poll for everyone, just your last parting thoughts on where you've seen corruption. That's something that the Integrity Management Committee can take away from this webinar, and we'll start to look at ways that we can provide you with tools and guidance to help you in this important fight. So if you're able to just go ahead and click on the poll, as many areas as you've seen that were relevant, we'll give another 10 to 15 seconds, take the results and go ahead and post them so we can all see just collectively where all of the participants on this call are seeing corruption, and just showing us where across the broad expanse of this fight, where we have to go in the things that we have to focus on. So if we could take a quick look at what the outcome of the poll is. It looks like our funding and procuring agencies, that really dovetails with some of the challenges that we saw at the earlier poll about corruption within construction. But it looks like there's quite a broad spectrum of challenges that we've all experienced. And you know, noticing that you've given us 90 minutes of your important time to spend with us on the topic of combating corruption, I do want to leave you with the thoughts of two very illustrious colleagues of mine, James Wanji, and then of course Nelson Ogenshakin. So James, I'll turn things over to you for a couple of closing comments, please.
Thank you very much. And let me take this opportunity to thank all the speakers and the participants. I am thoroughly impressed at the rate at which the questions have been coming. And I know that we probably needed a whole day to discuss this. And to me, what I see with these comments is that people are concerned. People have seen corruption, smelled corruption, and they want to do something about corruption. So thank you very much for the comments that keep coming in. I would like to say this is not the last seminar. This is the first one by the FIDIC Integrity Management Committee. As we go forward, we will be narrowing it down on different topics so that we can distill the issues and come out even better. But a couple of points that I would like to note and share. Firstly, that we should not discourage anybody from reporting corruption, and it is important to report corruption. And I think one thing that I take home is that corrupt deeds lead to corruption, and we must talk about corruption, and in so doing, we do something about corruption. And therefore, I thought it isn't something that we need to keep to ourselves. We should see value in discussing it openly, and in so doing, make those who practice it have a harder time as they try and practice it. And that led very well to the discussion we had about collective responsibility. I think I like the fact that people can come together, and on top of that, the icing being that it actually makes a business case. It means that you can actually have returns out of doing the right thing. And another key thing was that through collective action, you can actually engage government to change legislation, to change policy, to create, and in so doing, create a level playing field that all of us would like to have, because it's sad to see that those who sometimes get awarded these works do not have the capacity, do not have the skill, and the end product that comes out of it is certainly doesn't meet the requirements. I also like the fact that as the world grapples with sustainability, as the world focuses on sustainability, these ugly monster of corruption again impedes sustainability development. And therefore, no way out but to come up with ways to help overcome this challenge, and in so doing, be able to get more value out of the money that is spent in sustainability development. And I like the fact, one of the things that I also took out is the fact that Transparency International has ranked infrastructure development to be probably one of the worst, if not the worst, sectors. And I think that means that we are working in a very dirty place. We wear white, but it's not easy to stay white or your clothing to stay white. So that means that we need to collectively do something. The estimate of the fact that they could be up to 10% waste, it just makes me think, especially for us from the developing country, what that 10% would do. And I know in some countries such as where I'm coming from, it has been estimated that corruption could be eating up to 30% of the national budget. You can imagine what positive social impact that could have on the people and ultimately on the country. The other thing that perhaps I would also like to say is that I was very, very impressed by the MCC from Liberia, to see that it comes from the third world, from Africa, and that there is a proactive step that was taken towards coming up with a structured, comprehensive system to fight corruption. And I like the fact that those who were going to see the minister thinking that they could tempt them, find that it is the minister who is part of this initiative to come up with a system to stop corruption. I say congratulations. We need to get that now cascaded to the entire country. I hope that this concept can be sold to probably the regional bodies such as the African Union, then can help that, and then these lessons that have come out of it can be cascaded to other countries, not only in Africa, but everywhere else. And I think that would be an excellent thing as we go on and fight corruption. The classic example of collective action of the Marine Anti-Corruption Network, it is amazing that they saw that the only way they could overcome the challenges they had was through this collective action. Thoroughly impressed that they could do it, meaning that if you go and approach any one of its members, the answer remains the same, that we're not going to engage in this. And there is really strength in numbers. And therefore, given the question that there was about, which you asked Richard about membership associations, it tells me that we are still to tap the full power of membership organizations in fighting these vices. And therefore, this is going to be a very important lesson. I'm excited that FIDIC is able to host this in the YouTube, meaning that those who didn't make it today will have the opportunity. So we need, in closing, to see the benefit of building consensus within an industry. I like that. I like the fact that FIDIC has tools, and the fact that, like the ISO 737,000 on the bribery side, which is on the supply side of corruption, is a powerful tool. My country has tried to come up with a bribery act. Indeed, we have it, but we don't have the regulations yet. So it means that we not only talk about those on the other side, but we talk about ourselves on the supply side. And I like this one, and I believe it came from you, Aisha. Systems help tackle corruption. So there's got to be a system. It's got to be structured. It's got to be comprehensive, and then it's got to be improved. And that means governance, like we saw with the MCC, ETC, strong governance, ETC. So I am very, very excited and extremely happy that we were able to come this far and learn so much. And I would like to encourage all to please, especially the participants, get ready for the next one. Don't get tired. We are in this journey together. And thank you very much for all the speakers. Wonderful presentations. Continue the good work. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Nelson.
Well, James, thank you very much. How can I match that summary of the main topic that is being discussed? I'm always very amazed by the level of discussion. And let me start by saying the subject is being covered very well, eloquently by Lyndon White from Australia, from Ahmed, from Germany, Aisha, and also Dennis, and also our colleague from Liberia. I have made a lot of notes. I don't think, going over those notes will help in any way or form. We've busted our time in the sense that I get Barbara telling me we are 7 minutes late. We always try to keep this to something that is sharp. But I actually thought, there will be a few lessons that I think I just want to share with you. We've spent a lot of time talking about our side, which is really the supply side, and said very little about the demand side, which is pretty sad. Because, one subject that came up again and again is leadership. The example in Liberia is about leadership. Can we find more of that example in countries? And it saddened me, as Aisha said, when you have some advanced and sophisticated country, that prime minister or past president are being caught for bribery and corruption. Where does that leave the world? So the real takeaway for me is that, yes, FIDIC have an obligation to continue to promote, combating, bribery and corruption. A number of takeaway from our member association. What are we doing? Can we do enough? From the firms, what are we doing? Can we do enough? From the FIDIC point of view, what are we doing? Can we do more? And how do we engage the client? And the word that I hear again and again, which Aisha talked about, is being collective, collaborative approach. Can we, deal with the fear of unknown? Can we look at the lack of access and all about, making it, the transaction more meaningful? Can we seek out, what is best in the industry? And can we actually walk across the industry in such a way we can deliver a sustainable industry? Sustainability is not just purely about environmental. It's also about the industry, it's about our society. And if corruption is biting our hands, our head, and back way, it will bite our body. We need to do something about it. And I'm really pleased that we've done something today. Now, I want to start, by saying massive thank you to Lyndon White from Australia, for, Stephen from Ahmed, and Aisha, and also Dennis, and the other guy from, from Liberia, and more important to Richard, who eloquently hosted this particular, gathering. I very much enjoy the way you've actually packaged your work and before you deliver that. And James, how can I go without saying thank you? You've been a big advocate of this issue. You drive it across Kenya. I hope you can drive it across the whole of Africa and Middle East and all over the world. Combating what's it called, bribery and corruption is not a new subject for us, but we cannot give up. I like John Rich's comment. Let's look into other industry. Let's see what we can learn from there. Let's take it forward. Is film working enough? If it's not, how do we take it to the next level? How do we make it a real issue that our industry can be seen? I don't like the point when people say the construction industry is most corrupt. The defense industry is most corrupt. And it's got the government at different level into it. The challenge we have is that our industry is fragmented, and therefore the demand side can take us for a run. We need to work and act together as an industry. And if you do so, and we learn the word no, we are not bidding, we are not participating, we are not doing that. If we learn to do that, then our industry will be more better. So on this note, I want to say thank you very much to all the panelists and to Richard, who led this particular area, and also to my team behind the scene, Barbara, Andy, Chanel, everybody behind the scene who's keeping the whole process going from. Thank you very much. I am informed that we have 1,200 people register for the next webinar. So guys, keep up the good work. And even though we have COVID, we are reaching out. And I'm so pleased that every member are able to join us. John, I don't know, you're looking very fresh. Having started early this morning in Canada, you're looking very, very fresh. You put me to shame. So on that note, I would suggest, please, wherever you are, keep safe and avoid bribery and corruption. Learn to say no. If you see it, talk about it and shout about it. Take care and God bless you. Bye.